The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitman Academy's pristine hallways as 12-year-old Grace Patterson sat alone on the marble bench outside the principal's office, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the floor. Despite being surrounded by the chatter and laughter of her wealthy classmates, rushing to their next classes, Grace existed in a world of complete silence, not by choice but by birth. Born profoundly deaf, Grace had spent her entire life watching. Conversations happen around her like silent movies she could never fully understand. Her father, billionaire tech mogul William Patterson, had spared no expense on her education, enrolling her in the most prestigious private school in Manhattan and hiring the best tutors money could buy. But what he couldn't purchase was something far more valuable, genuine connection. At Whitman Academy, Grace was known as Patterson's deaf daughter. More of a curiosity than a classmate, teachers spoke slowly and loudly at her as if volume could somehow penetrate her deafness, then grew frustrated when she couldn't follow their rapid-fire lessons designed for hearing students. Her classmates had long since stopped trying to include her in their conversations, finding it easier to ignore her entirely than to struggle with basic communication. Grace had learned to read lips reasonably well, but the skill was exhausting and imperfect. She missed jokes, couldn't follow group conversations, and often felt like an outsider looking in on a world that had no place for her. Her expensive hearing aids helped minimally, and her father's solution to everything was always the same: more money, better technology, higher-priced specialists. That Tuesday afternoon, Grace had been sent to the principal's office not for misbehavior, but because her literature teacher, Mrs. Hartwell, had grown exasperated, trying to explain a poetry assignment that relied heavily on auditory elements, like rhyme and meter. I don't know what to do with her. Mrs. Hartwell had complained to Principal Reynolds, speaking about Grace as if she weren't sitting right there. How can she understand poetry when she can't hear the musicality of language? It's not fair to the other students to slow down the entire curriculum. Now Grace sat waiting for her father to arrive for yet another meeting about her accommodation needs, a phrase she'd learned to hate because it made her sound broken, like something that required constant fixing. That's when Carlos Mendoza appeared around the corner, pushing his cleaning cart with quiet efficiency. At 55, Carlos had been the head janitor at Whitman Academy for 8 years, invisible to most of the wealthy families who sent their children there. He was the man who cleaned up their messes, emptied their trash, and maintained the pristine environment they took for granted. But Carlos noticed things others missed. He'd been watching Grace for months, seeing how she sat alone during lunch, how she flinched when teachers raised their voices in frustration, how she'd given up raising her hand in class, even when her written work showed she understood the material perfectly. As Carlos approached with his cleaning supplies, he saw Grace's shoulders shaking slightly. She was crying, but silently, the way children cry when they've learned that making noise won't bring comfort. Carlos stopped his cart and looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then he did something that would change both their lives forever. He sat down on the bench beside Grace and gently tapped her shoulder. When Grace looked up, startled, Carlos smiled warmly and began to move his hands in fluid, graceful gestures. "Hello, beautiful girl. My name is Carlos. Are you okay?" Grace's eyes widened in shock. Someone was signing to her, not the stilted, textbook ASL that her expensive tutors used, but the natural, expressive language of someone who truly understood. She stared at Carlos for a moment, then tentatively signed back. "You know sign language?" "My son is deaf," Carlos replied, his hands moving with practiced ease. "I learned when he was little. He's 25 now, a teacher at a school for deaf children in California." For the first time in months, Grace's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Really? He's deaf like me?" "Just like you. And just like you, he's brilliant and funny and deserves to be heard, even when the world doesn't always know how to listen." Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the joy of effortless communication. Here was an adult who didn't speak to her slowly or loudly, who didn't look frustrated when she didn't immediately understand, who treated her deafness as simply another way of being, human rather than a problem to be solved. "What's your son's name?" Grace asked, her hands moving more confidently now. David Mendoza. He teaches third grade and his students love him. They don't care that he can't hear. They care that he understands them. Their conversation was interrupted by the click of expensive heels on marble as Principal Reynolds approached with Grace's father in tow. William Patterson was a man accustomed to commanding every room he entered, his presence radiating the kind of power that came with a net worth, measured in billions. "Grace, there you are," he said, his voice carrying the slight impatience of someone whose time was valuable. "We need to discuss your academic situation." Grace's expression immediately closed off, her moment of joy evaporating as she prepared for another conversation about her limitations, her special needs, her failure to fit into the hearing world her father had constructed around her. Carlos stood up respectfully, preparing to continue his work, but Grace grabbed his arm. "Please don't go," she signed, panic in her eyes. Carlos looked from Grace to her father, then made a decision that would take more courage than most people ever needed to show. "Mr. Patterson," he said quietly, "excuse me, but your daughter was just telling me about her poetry assignment. She has some really interesting thoughts about how visual imagery can create rhythm and meaning even without sound." William frowned, clearly confused by why the janitor was speaking to him about his daughter's schoolwork. "I'm sorry, but we have a meeting with the principal about Grace's academic accommodations." "Tell him I don't need accommodations," Grace signed to Carlos with sudden fierce determination. "Tell him I need understanding." Carlos looked at this powerful man who could fire him with a single phone call, then looked at Grace's hopeful face, and chose courage over self-preservation. "Mr. Patterson, your daughter just told me she doesn't need accommodations. She needs understanding. And with respect, sir, she's right." "You understand sign language?" William asked, his tone sharpening with surprise. "My son is deaf. I've been watching Grace for months, seeing how isolated she is here, how hard she's trying to fit into a world that wasn't designed for her. But the problem isn't Grace. It's that no one here speaks her language." Principal Reynolds looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mr. Mendoza, perhaps you should return to your duties." "No," William interrupted, his business instincts recognizing something important was happening. "Continue, Mr. Mendoza. What exactly are you observing about my daughter?" Carlos took a deep breath. "Grace is brilliant, Mr. Patterson. Her written work is exceptional. Her understanding of complex concepts is advanced for her age, and her artistic abilities are remarkable. But she's being judged by hearing standards in a hearing world, and that's not fair to her." He turned to Grace. "Tell your father what you told me about poetry." Grace's hands moved as she signed, and Carlos interpreted. "She says that poetry isn't just about rhyme and meter. It's about painting pictures with words, creating emotions through imagery, building connections between ideas. She says she can see the rhythm of a poem in the way the lines flow on the page, in the patterns the words create, in the feelings they evoke." William stared at his daughter, seeing her animated expression as she communicated through Carlos, seeing the intelligence and passion that he'd somehow missed in all their stilted conversations through interpreters and written notes. "Tell him about your story, Carlos," encouraged Grace. "The one about the girl who could hear colors." As Grace signed enthusiastically and Carlos interpreted, William learned that his daughter had been writing a novel about a girl who experienced the world through synesthesia, seeing sounds as colors and feeling music as textures. It was sophisticated, creative work that showed a deep understanding of sensory experience and human emotion. "Why haven't I seen this story?" William asked, his voice softer now. "Because no one ever asked me about my writing." Grace signed, and Carlos translated. "Everyone's too busy trying to fix my hearing to notice that my mind works perfectly." The truth of her words hit William like a physical blow. He'd spent years and millions of dollars trying to make Grace fit into the hearing world, but he'd never stopped to consider that maybe the hearing world needed to make space for her instead. That afternoon marked the beginning of a transformation that extended far beyond Grace's education. William hired Carlos as Grace's personal educational advocate, despite Carlos's protests that he wasn't qualified for such a position. "You're the most qualified person I know," William told him. "You saw my daughter when everyone else was looking at her disability." Within 6 months, William had worked with deaf educators and advocates to establish the first fully bilingual ASL English program at Whitman Academy. Grace became the program's first student, but not its last. Soon, deaf and hearing students were learning together, with ASL recognized as a legitimate language rather than an accommodation. Carlos's son, David, was hired to lead the program, moving from California to New York to help build something revolutionary. A school where deaf students weren't just accommodated but celebrated, where their language and culture were valued as enriching. The entire educational community, Grace blossomed in this new environment. Her novel about synesthesia was published by a major publishing house when she was 15, with proceeds going to deaf literacy programs. She became an advocate for deaf rights, speaking at conferences and schools about the importance of linguistic accessibility. But perhaps the most profound change was in William himself. Learning ASL to communicate directly with his daughter opened up a relationship he'd never known was possible. Their conversations evolved from logistical exchanges about school and schedules to deep discussions about dreams, fears, philosophy, and art. I spent so much time trying to bring Grace into my world, William reflected years later, that I never realized how much richer my world could become by entering hers. Carlos, meanwhile, discovered that his years of advocacy for his son had prepared him for something he'd never expected, becoming a bridge between the deaf and hearing worlds, helping families navigate the complex emotions and practical realities of raising deaf children. 5 years after that first conversation on the marble bench, Grace graduated as valedictorian of Whitman Academy's inaugural bilingual class. Her graduation speech, delivered in both ASL and spoken English, brought the entire audience to tears as she talked about the difference between being accommodated and being understood. For most of my life, she signed and spoke, people tried to fix my deafness, but Carlos Mendoza was the first person who tried to understand it instead. He taught me that I wasn't broken. The world just needed to learn my language. Today, the Patterson Foundation funds deaf education programs across the country, supporting not just academic achievement but cultural pride and linguistic identity. Grace studies at Gallaudet University, the world's premier institution for deaf and hard of hearing students, majoring in deaf education and creative writing. Carlos oversees the foundation's school programs, traveling the country to help educators understand that accommodation isn't about making deaf students more like hearing students. It's about recognizing that diversity of experience enriches everyone's education. Sometimes the most profound connections happen when we least expect them, between people from different worlds, different languages, different experiences. Sometimes it takes a janitor's wisdom to show a billionaire that true wealth isn't measured in hearing, aids, and speech therapy, but in understanding, acceptance, and the courage to let love transcend the barriers that language, class, and assumption can create. In Grace's world of silence, Carlos's signing hands became the bridge to a community she'd never known existed, a community where she wasn't the girl who couldn't hear, but simply a girl whose voice deserved to be seen, understood, and celebrated.